Hello and welcome to Grow Conversations, your window into the world of medical cannabis here in the United Kingdom. My name's Alex Fraser. I'm your host. I'm also patient access lead at GW Pharma. And on today's episode, I am speaking to Dean Billington. Dean is COO of Brains Bioceuticals. Welcome to the show, Dean.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you here. So I guess to start off with, it'd be lovely to hear just a little bit more about yourself and your sort of your career leading up to your work in the cannabis industry.
Yeah, sure, I can do that. So my name is Dean Billington. As you say, I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Brains Bioceuticals. And I also manage the BSPG Laboratories facility, which is a subsidiary of Brains Bioceuticals based in the UK, where we manufacture our CBD API. So I started in the industry, in the pharma industry, at least a very, very long time ago. Initially contract analytical testing, leading one of the UK's largest contract testing laboratories, and then moved into clinical trials in the early 2000s, initially with Fisher Clinical Services and then with a number of other companies. Subsequently started my own consultancy business in CMC, analytical clinical support. I'm a qualified person for clinical trial material. Previously, I've worked as a QP with GW Pharmaceuticals, also based in the UK, and I joined BSPG in 2016, initially to help them achieve GMP, although they didn't necessarily understand what GMP actually meant. In 2017, we had our first MHRA inspection. In early 2018, we were granted our GMP certification for the CBD for both human and veterinary use. And we're also registered with the MHRA as an active substance manufacturer. We've had a number of owners over the years, originally owned by a single individual as an entrepreneur who subsequently sold it to a Canadian biotech company. And then 12 months later, we were purchased by Brains Bioceuticals. So also based in Canada, as it happens. And that kind of brings us up to date in terms of where we are.
Fantastic. And it sounds like you've got that experience that we particularly do need, I feel, in UK medical cannabis when we're looking at bringing these medicines into the realm of sort of traditional clinical settings, clinical trials, and maintaining those standards. And you mentioned GMP, and you know, I want to get into that a little bit later on, but and the importance of that. But before we do, it'll be great to get an idea a bit more about the sort of the current work that Brains are doing. I know you did mention a little bit sort of what you've led up to and where you are, but what's the big latest news for Brains, and what have you guys been up to more recently?
Okay, so Brains Bioceuticals really has a number of pillars to the business model. From a pharmaceutical perspective, that clearly sits currently with BSPG in the UK, serving both the pharmaceutical and the veterinary side of the business. And then in addition to that, we have pillars in wellness, in athletics, and potentially in the future, cosmetics. So those are distinct pillars of the business, but obviously the CBD that we produce crosses all of those pillars with the view from a Brains ideological perspective that we will always use the best quality CBD in all of our products.
Which is obviously very reassuring to hear for those who might be looking into CBD as a prescribed medicine, or particularly for physicians who are looking to get involved in prescribing. So it's fantastic to hear that you have that commitment to quality, and that extends to different markets outside of just pharmaceutical prescribed access, but also to, as you say, wellness, amongst other things as well. So and perhaps you can give us an idea of why that's so important. I know that the UK CBD industry and regulations around that have been a topic of much discussion recently. From your perspective, why is it so important to maintain these standards throughout your operations, rather than, you know, you could quite easily have high standards for a pharmaceutical product and perhaps slightly lower standards for over the counter, but why would you choose not to do that?
So we chose not to do that as a business because we wanted to provide the highest possible quality product for all of the arms, all of the pillars of the business, essentially. There is no real logic in saying that, okay, if we're producing a product for pharmaceutical, that should be at a higher grade, if you like, than something being used in a food supplement or a cosmetic, still being used by the consumer, potentially food supplements, etc., still being ingested. So our view was that we should adopt the highest possible standards that we can and push that across the whole of the range of the products. The CBD market is a very interesting market, as I'm sure you would appreciate. And over the years, the industry has been significantly criticized for the poor quality of materials. There have been a number of studies done where samples have been tested from the marketplace, some found to contain significant levels of THC, which is obviously a psychoactive and also a controlled substance. Some found to contain no CBD at all. And our approach was that we didn't want to be part of that, and we wanted to be, we aspire to be the best CBD company in the world, essentially. And therefore those standards are appropriate to achieve that goal.
So it sounds like it's twofold. I mean, it's partly having a reputation as a producer of the highest quality product, but it's also very much keeping the end consumer in mind, regardless of the reason that they're ingesting or utilizing CBD. You want to make sure that they have the best product possible. And I suppose that's about building trust between the consumer and the brand as well. And as you say, that is absolutely something that we have had issues with in the UK, particularly with over-the-counter CBD and certain brands. We won't name any names, but as you say, there's quite a lot of research out there showing that certain brands or certain products particularly aren't up to standard. And it's wonderful to hear that we have a company now here, and you're based in the UK, aren't you? I think you said at the beginning.
Yeah, we're based in what was the old Pfizer facility, which is now called Discovery Park, and that's a science hub in the southeast of England. Just wanted to add one more point to the reasoning in terms of demonstrating our ability to produce the best quality products. And yes, it's about reputation, but it's also about having the data to be able to support the claims that you make. So we adopt the highest standards of documentation. All our batches are tested to a full specification, as you would expect from a GMP perspective. But again, that covers all elements of the areas that our CBD is used in, not just specifically the pharmaceutical area. So where we make a claim, we have the data, comprehensive, robust data packs to back those claims up.
That's fantastic. And developing data on cannabinoids is something that I'm very passionate about. I know we're very passionate about at Grow. I'm sure you're very passionate about at Bioceuticals. Is something that I'm trying to focus on with Grow Conversations as that sort of progresses here in the UK. Perhaps you can give us some highlights of some of the studies that you're working on and perhaps some of the sort of key insights there that you've managed to glean, or perhaps it's something where these are still ongoing, but it would be fascinating to learn a bit more about the more R&D side of the business.
Yeah, so obviously as a CBD API manufacturer, we don't currently manufacture products per se, but we work with other companies who subsequently produce products for dosing into clinical trials. So either via oral liquids or even capsules containing CBD in an oil fat formulation to aid digestion. So our material has been used in a number of clinical trials throughout the world. There are active studies ongoing in Australia with the University of Melbourne. Our material is currently being used in a phase 3 clinical study in Brazil for epilepsy, which ultimately will lead to an application for marketing authorization. And we're also in discussions with a number of other organizations as well, both in the UK and mainland Europe, to support them in their studies. So we have a philosophy where we will, as Brains, try and support initiatives to progress clinical data. So we may provide the material without cost. We may also provide the material without cost and contribute financially. We're currently talking to a large institution in the US who are about to file an IND, investigational new drug application, with the FDA. And again, to support that, we have a comprehensive data package. So that includes an active substance master file, although technically we don't need one currently, we have one. We're about to file a DMF in the US. That will be done Q1, which will be beneficial to organizations, again, in the US and elsewhere, who want to use our material in trials. And we're regularly talking to organizations about potential clinical trials for CBD in lots and lots of different areas. Obviously, the main area currently tends to be, or historically has been, epilepsy. But there are studies ongoing in terms of alcohol dependency, cannabis addiction, and trying to wean people off cannabis onto CBD initially, smoking cessation, PTSD, things like Parkinson's disease, anxiety, depression, etc. So a whole variety of therapeutic areas that are being looked into with CBD.
And that's fantastic. So it's, I mean, you're talking about clinical studies literally all over the world: Australia, Brazil, the USA, and other places, and also, you know, multiple therapy areas as well. So it sounds like the work you're doing is broad in many senses, and it's encouraging to hear that there's a company that really prioritizes those high standards, but is also looking at such a sort of wide range of applications of CBD. And I think that's you know, one of the things that makes CBD particularly special, not just as a medicine, but also as a cannabinoid, is it has potentially these many different you know, effects within the body. And I know you touched on epilepsy there, and it'd be really interesting to get your view on that particular conversation, because I think there are multiple viewpoints on the treatment of epilepsy with cannabinoids. Sort of where does Brains stand in that particular you know, paradigm?
So I think, I mean, the two principal approaches is one being the use of cannabis, which is obviously a very complex combination of many structures and molecules in different concentrations. And that approach would be, if the cannabis as a mix has an effect, then do you really need to understand the effect of the individual components, many of which are not understood. I mean, I think cannabis has probably 1,044 cannabinoids, many other compounds contained within terpenes, flavonoids, etc. And we understand very little about the vast majority of those. I guess CBD and THC are probably the most understood cannabinoids of that. And then you have the other approach, which is the approach that we've taken, that it's very important to understand the effect of the individual cannabinoids, hence why we focused on producing CBD API in isolation. We can understand how the CBD works. Going forward, as part of our ongoing research, we're also looking at opportunities to produce THC and other cannabinoids in their purest form, with the opportunity to be able to recombine them once you fully understand the way in which the individual cannabinoids act, because that certainly isn't the case if you take the alternate approach with cannabis. And of course, there could be a situation where some of those cannabinoids present are acting against the CBD THC. The answer is we simply don't know, and one would argue that that's not necessarily good science.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I think it's fascinating to see the potential, and we see, you know, enormous amounts of anecdotal evidence for people utilizing, you know, what would be, you know, full extract, broad spectrum, whatever terminology you want to use for the sort of the soup of cannabinoids and flavonoids and terpenes, and it's fantastic to see patients and individuals having a benefit from that. But I do agree from a scientific standpoint, for the longevity of the use of cannabinoids and to properly understand the potential of the plants and everything within it, we really do need to pull it apart and be sort of rigorously scientific. And I think, you know, if I was going to play devil's advocate to that, I would say, well, there's, like you say, hundreds of compounds there. How long is that going to take? Is that something that, are we talking years? Are we talking decades? Are we even talking longer than that? Because of quite the amount of different cannabinoids. Obviously, there's a role for biotech companies to pull apart the plant and to isolate those different compounds, and they have different levels of stability, so there's issues there. But outside of overcoming that, let's say we could pull them apart just to do the research that's needed. What are the sort of timeframes? And do you see that as a hindrance, or do you see that more as more as having potential and just having lots of different compounds for you to actually, you know, isolate and explore?
I think there's a number of different combinations that would affect that. I mean, you said earlier, lots of anecdotal evidence, and yes, indeed, there is. Unfortunately, the plural of anecdotes is not data. So one does need to generate at some point the data. And I think in terms of timelines for doing that, I think it very much depends on the appetite of both the end user, the patients, the regulatory authorities, and the industry generally, in terms of whether there is truly an appetite to truly understand the way in which individual cannabinoids act and how they act once they're within a plant-based product such as cannabis. And that timeline is wholly dependent upon how much input people, companies, regulatory authorities, countries, interested parties are willing to make in terms of that investment.
Absolutely. And I suppose that is sort of still something that we're not 100% on. It's going to be a sort of wait and see that how much interest there is.
Yeah, I mean, again, there are two approaches, and very importantly, we should never lose sight and never lose focus of the point that the most important person in all of this is the patient at the end who derives the benefit, and we need to be doing what's best for the patient. And certainly there may be a combination of, in certain instances, if given cannabis and not understanding the true chemistry and mechanisms of action actually works for that patient. On one hand, you would argue that that is acceptable because the patient ultimately is deriving the benefit. The challenge to that is you don't necessarily know how they're deriving the benefit. And obviously, particularly in children, whereas they grow up and their potential needs change for the combination of cannabinoids change, you know, would it be better to understand that? And if we have a better understanding of the individual cannabinoids, perhaps that treatment regime is made easier by doing that. So, you know, a number of children and the regime would be typically CBD first with no THC because obviously of its psychoactive effects, and then introduce small amounts of THC. As children grow and develop, their requirement for the THC changes, and what you tend to see in some cases is that the level of THC needs to increase and increase. And obviously, understanding that means that we can have a compound with CBD and THC only, and we're not giving any other compounds that may have an adverse effect to that, or may have other effects that we don't yet fully know and fully understand.
Absolutely. So, I mean, it's that from a patient advocate perspective, of course, which is sort of the world that I come from. You've got on one hand the desire to treat patients who are suffering now, and we can talk till the cows come home about regulatory barriers there and what government might do to help that happen, and that's a sort of a conversation for another day. But then we have this wider concept that if we don't fully understand this and fully pull it apart and really realize and identify the precise actions that are happening with not just CBD and THC, but also the different ratios with, like you see, different patients at different age groups, for example, then we're somewhat doing a disservice for the patients of the future. And you have to have this. And also
therapeutic areas of the future, because if we have a good understanding of the individual cannabinoids, that potentially gives us a better ability to decide on various combinations to treat various diseases going forward in the future as well.
And if we understand that, and doctors and prescribers understand that fully, it no longer becomes a trial and error, but it becomes, we know that this ratio, you've got a, let's say a 14-year-old going through puberty, we know exactly the ratio that this particular patient is going to need for whatever particular symptoms they're suffering from. And that knowledge, it's potentially going to save lives. And I think that is, people often see the urgency and the immediacy of needing access now, and they don't fully understand the need for this research. And actually that there are patients in the future, some of whom may not even be born yet, who will, benefit from having a proper understanding of this if we're able to, like you say, get the funding and do the trials and fully elucidate these compounds.
I mean, one of the reasons the BSPG was started in the first place, because we were very conscious that particularly young children will be given what was claimed to be high purity CBD, but clearly contained, in some cases, not insignificant levels of THC. And if you looked at those young children, you would see that generally they had very red eyes. They were quite spaced out most of the time because of the effects of the THC, etc. But in a product that was claimed to have no THC. And we've got evidence and data to show that when you move those individuals onto pure CBD, i.e. genuinely with no THC, their quality of life improves significantly. The redness around the eyes disappears within a matter of days. Their general awareness and consciousness changes significantly. They become far more alert, etc. So, those are the types of things that certainly spur me on as an individual to try and give benefit to the end users, irrespective of age, irrespective of what the disease is. If we can improve quality of life for a patient, then we are achieving our objectives. In my opinion.
I know, and I completely agree with you. And I think, we have this idea, I think, particularly in patient groups, that comparative to perhaps other medicines, we can talk about anti-epileptic drugs, opiates and antidepressants, that there's a relatively, I don't want to use the word safe, but there's a safety profile that's comparably perhaps better, at least from the perspective of patients, but that we also have to be very aware of those side effects. And particularly in young people, we know that THC can have an impact on developing brains. And we know something about that, but we also don't fully understand that too, and the implications of that in these patients who perhaps are taking THC at a young age, and what impact that might have for their development. And it may be something that's of minor concern, but it may be something that's much more serious, and we won't fully understand that unless we do this research.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Brains Bioceuticals as an organization are absolutely committed to do whatever we can to further that research. As I said earlier, not just in CBD, but also in other cannabinoids going forward.
Fantastic. And I do want to, I'd love to get a view on where you're looking in terms of different cannabinoids and where things are moving beyond CBD. But I also, just before we move on, I know, because I have this habit of saying I want to return to this before we move on to this, and then forgetting to return to it. But just for our viewers who might not understand, can you perhaps explain the importance of EU GMP and what that really means in terms of product development and for a company like Brains?
So from a GMP perspective, good manufacturing practice, what that really means is that you follow a set of defined guidelines, principles, and operating practices to ensure that you are providing the best quality product in a consistent way, meeting all of the guidelines and regulations that exist, ranging all the way from solvents through to impurities, through to overall purity, and many other guidelines such as the ICH guidelines, etc. So GMP is the framework to enable you to do that in a consistent and sustained way, and also in a way that you can demonstrate that you have followed those relevant requirements and practices. So very, 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 very important. Unfortunately, in the CBD industry, there are many companies who claim to have GMP. Generally, in some cases, that unfortunately is not the case. But there is a UDRA GMP website that anybody can access on a public basis and check the credentials of any company who claim to have GMP certification, GDP, so good distribution practice distribution, or indeed are an API registered manufacturing activity.
So it's very, very high standard of production, and it's also transparent as well. So if you are a consumer, and your product says EU GMP on it, you can go online straight away and check that.
Yes, you can check the credibility of the organisation, and obviously that is verified periodically with the competent authorities. In our case, that's the MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency in the UK, and they will periodically come to site for 1 or 2 days, and they will look at all the documentation to support the activities that we've been undertaking in all aspects of the manufacturing process, from the initial raw materials in to the final product, and beyond in some cases that come out at the end of the process.
Fantastic. So it's not even just standards that you have to keep to, but it's also that there is a process whereby there are essentially inspections of facilities, and it's quite rigorous, is what you're saying. Yeah,
I mean, GMP is as well as a regulation, is an ethos that everyone has to adopt and embrace within the organisation, and it all links together to produce a high quality product at the end, which is, as I say, very consistent, free from any elements that shouldn't be there. In our case, particularly, we're looking there at the THC. So our CBD product contains no THC. So for the technical people, that means that it's less than the limit of detection for the analytical method. Our limit of detection is 0.506%. So a very, very tiny amount. And actually, when you look at the chromatography, there is no noise on the baseline at the retention time that one would expect to see THC. So truly none present. And we've had our material analyzed by, obviously, all of our customers who buy the material from us will then independently have it tested, particularly looking at the THC as well as other parameters. But we've also had it tested by a number of other national agencies. And they have confirmed that there is no THC present. So again, it's not just the laboratory that we run as BSPG that's saying there's no THC, but independent verification is showing that there is no THC in the product. We've manufactured in excess of 250 batches over the last couple of years, and there has never been an instance where we have seen THC in any of those batches. So again, that just points to a very consistent, validated manufacturing process with very good controls in place to ensure the quality of the finished product.
That's brilliant, and I'm sure again, really helps build that confidence in those Brains products as well, to anyone who's sort of aware of this and wants to look into it, and that you have that level of data and that level of rigor. So I really appreciate you explaining that for our viewers. It's something that getting it from your perspective and really hearing those details of what it means to go through that EU GMP process. I think it might be something that a lot of the time consumers don't fully understand and appreciate the sort of the necessity of. And you've explained that perfectly. So thank you very much for giving us that insight.
No problem.
We were talking about your work sort of beyond CBD, and you have mentioned THC, but I wonder, and something I love to ask, because I'm a bit of a cannabis geek, or a cannabinoid geek, or whatever you want to call it, and I'd love to know a little bit more about whether you're looking into some of the minor cannabinoids, whether terpenes are something that feature perhaps in some of your R&D work or your development work, or where Brain stands with a view to sort of the wider, not spectrum, but the other.
Sure.
Cannabinoids.
So our current focus is the cannabinoids rather than any other groups of compounds. That does not mean to say that in the future we won't necessarily look at those. But today, principal focus cannabinoids. THC is of particular importance, of course, because of its links with cannabis and the potential treatments that already exist for THC. There are a number of isomers of THC, principally delta 8 and delta 9 THC. Delta 9 THC is the psychoactive, But there is also increasing interest in Delta 8, which may have very similar properties to the Delta 9 THC, but is not known to be a psychoactive. So again, if we can develop and as we go forward, look at mechanisms for producing very high purity THC, so a THC meeting the requirements of GMP, so as an API, Delta 8, Delta 9, and also there's some significant interest now being generated in things like CBN, cannabinol, CBG, and some of the minor, more minor cannabinoids as well. So we are active with the THC elements. We're actively pursuing interest in CBN, CBG, and the others will follow. Again, as and when research is done to indicate that there may be some significant benefit with a particular individual cannabinoid, as opposed to a mixture of multiple cannabinoids and other compounds as well.
Fantastic, and maybe 6 months to a year from now we'll get you back on the show, and we perhaps will have some more data on. I mean, I suppose that's another good question with that. I mean, is this very early stage? Do we think we'll have data on these rare cannabinoids soon, or is this 2 or 3 years down the line?
I think the rare cannabinoids probably a couple of years down the line, because again, the initial research really needs to be done. But certainly the increase of interest in cannabinoids generally is certainly increasing. So that would lead us to believe that there will be ultimately an acceleration of the interest. And obviously, where there is an interest and an opportunity, then there tends to be more research being undertaken.
Absolutely, and we're seeing that interest grow for multiple reasons. But I know that one of those reasons is that there's a particular interest in athletics and in sports. And I was on your website earlier today, and I was reading about Altis, which is you've got a laboratory that you're working with athletes. Could you tell us a little bit more about the work that you're moving slightly away from the pharmaceutical side of things, but also very much focused on health and human performance, shall we say? Love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so as I say, Brains Bioceuticals has a number of pillars to its business, athletics being one, and supporting of sports people. CBD is no longer on the banned substance list, the World Anti-Doping Agency banned substance list, and therefore can be used. And there's great interest in terms of the use of CBD for recovery from things like marathons, recovery from sports injuries, etc. And Altis Labs is part of that initiative, where they are using CBD in some of the treatments they give for recovering athletes, etc., to assess what benefit the CBD really does have. Does that significantly accelerate the recovery period? I mean, certainly I know marathon runners based in the UK who have taken CBD, CBD incidentally, who have taken CBD, and they report that their level of recovery after a marathon appeared to them to have been significantly quicker than it normally is. Now, again, anecdotal evidence, but in some ways compelling evidence to get companies to seriously look into that from a research perspective. And from our perspective, that's what Altis Labs is about. It's about generating data, in an informal way, if you like, rather than as part of a clinical trial initially, but then gathering that anecdotal data to put together a justification for doing more formal clinical trials and more formal assessments.
And I suppose you talk about the different levels of anecdotal data, but when you have athletes that are really working at that very top level and doing absolutely everything they can and monitoring their performance at every possible level, then those very small things that what we say small things, single things like CBD that are visibly having an impact on them and their performance, that's quite compelling. I'm sure.
And one would argue, of course, that can't be truly a placebo effect, because that's manifesting itself in a physical attribute. Recovery quicker, that's not in the mind. If a pulled muscle recovers quicker, again, that's not in the mind. That is a physical increase in the recovery rate. So, you know, it's a true indication that the CBD is working.
I think it's truly fascinating, and I'm sure we'll have athletes that are watching and at all levels who are interested in learning more about that as that develops. So you know, very interested in seeing how is it Altis ALTIS, isn't it? So
yes, Altis Labs.
Yeah,
so the key thing there, Alex, is again, THC is a banned substance. It's a controlled substance, but it's also a banned substance. So the key there is to be using CBD that can be clearly demonstrated not to contain any THC. There were a number of articles last year from the US where athletes were using CBD that they thought was THC free. They were subsequently dope tested and subsequently found to have the presence of THC as a result of taking CBD that wasn't as clean as the claims were. So, you know, very, very important that athletes are using a high quality CBD where, again, as our CBD can clearly demonstrate there is absolutely no THC present, and therefore there is no risk to having a doping test and being found to have THC present.
Which is, of course, absolutely a paramount importance to athletes, that they don't have that sort of red mark on their record and that they're not banned from performing for any length of time. So, I mean, and you're reiterating that importance of really having that level of purity and that level of rigor as well. So
yeah, and it's about athletes in general. I mean, it's not about a specific group of athletes, but from footballers to runners, etc. You know, there is benefit with CBD across a whole range of sports and sports injuries as well, and recovery from sports injuries.
So I mean, there's potentially an industry there that might even outscale. I mean, I don't know the full figures here, but it might even outscale pharmaceuticals in terms of the amount of people who might find benefit in their sort of athletic lives, as much as, you know, the number of patients who might benefit from using it for the wide number of you know, medical issues that it's being looked into.
Very possibly, and I think that's one of the interesting things with CBD generally is that there is a fair amount of evidence for certain indications such as epilepsy, but there is new research being done all of the time in terms of CBD using for other indications. PTSD, for example, is an area where there is great interest. So yeah, the scope, the breadth of potential for CBD is not limited just to a very narrow therapeutic area, as perhaps some other drugs are.
And again, highlighting that particular importance of the very isolate and the CBD on its own there. And I'm very aware that we're somewhat running out of the time that we have today for this episode, and I certainly don't want to keep you any longer because you've got a lot of very important work to do from what you're telling us. But I did want to ask one more question. It's a question I'm asking everyone at the moment with the current situation with the pandemic and with COVID-19. Really interested to know, has this pandemic had a particular impact on your operations with Brains? Has it potentially presented new opportunities? How has it affected you?
So from a manufacturing perspective, we've been very lucky. We've got a superb group of staff who have managed to keep going throughout the pandemic, obviously demonstrating the requirements of social distancing, etc. But they've all been very, very committed to continue to manufacture products such that the end user, the patient, is not in a situation where they can't have their medication, or indeed to interrupt the clinical trials that are ongoing. I mean, it's interesting that CBD has and continues to be used in a number of studies that are being done throughout the world, in fact, where there is, again, some anecdotal evidence to show that CBD may well result in enhancing recovery from COVID-19. Now, again, early stage trials, data to be produced. There are certainly a number of papers that have been produced by some very eminent people who suggest very strongly that CBD could certainly be a very significant contributor to aiding COVID-19 recovery. So again, that's very interesting for us as well.
Fascinating. So it's not even that it's just impacted your sort of day-to-day activities in terms of how you operate, but it's also presenting new opportunities for developing data and potentially helping very sick people as well.
Absolutely.
So and it sounds like incredibly important work that you're doing in many different areas. And I just want to thank you very much for sparing the time to talk to us today. It's been really, really fascinating to hear about brains and all the work that you're doing. Thank you again for your time. And thank you to everyone for watching Grow Conversations with us today. As always, do subscribe and like and follow and share and do all those lovely things and help us get the word out there about the medical cannabis and how everything works in the UK. And we'll see you very soon on another episode. Thank you and goodbye.